Hey guys, welcome back to the Sad Truth. It's been a while since I've had a chat, maybe a couple of weeks. I can't remember exactly how long it's been, but my current guest has entered the pantheon of very, very rare, honor of being a repeat guest on the Sad Truth. How you doing, Robert Spencer?
Just great, Gad. How you doing?
Good, very good. I just for those of you who don't know, we held a chat a couple of years ago. You could check it out. I'll put a link to it in the description. But you may not know of Robert's work, so let me just mention a few things. I won't list all the books, but some of his bestsellers, or two of his bestsellers, are "The Truth About Muhammad, Founder of the World's Most Intolerant Religion," and "The Politically Correct Incorrect Guide to Islam." Many, many other books. Check it out. His latest book is "The History of Jihad," his magnus opus. There you go. Excellent marketing. But before we start, I'm a bit confused. You ready? I need you to explain this to me because I'm utterly confused. Now, I know as a non Islamophobe that the true meaning of jihad is internal struggle. So, for example, my jihad is I should avoid eating french fries. My jihad is to not have impure thoughts about Linda Sarsour while being married. Those are my internal jihads. There are a whole bunch of other ones that the good folks from CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations, have come up with. My jihad is to stay fit despite my busy schedule. My jihad is to march on despite losing my son, and so on and so forth. So, what is your jihad? And then tell us if that is the true definition of jihad.
Yeah, my jihad is to get the word out about this book. And this book is all about Muslims getting their children to school on time, and Muslims getting to the gym regularly, and Muslims being humorful and having friends among non-Muslims, and Muslims blowing milk bubbles through straws, and all that for 448 pages. And so I hope you'll enjoy it.
So just to be clear, and then we'll move on. When I see endless exhortations, having grown up in the Middle East, for jihad from various imams in various mosques, where they seem really angry, where they seem really belligerent, they're really just asking the congregation to stay fit and avoid carbs. I mean, is that correct?
Yeah, because everybody knows carbs are a killer. And so the imams, their primary goal is to inculcate a spirit of jihad in their followers. And that means eating good, balanced meals, organically grown meat, and lay off the carbs, lay off the ice cream, and then their jihad is complete. And that's what this book is really all about. That's what the history of jihad is, the history of Muslims going around being charming.
Perfect. So now let's discuss the other Islamophobic explanation of jihad, which you cover in the book, where you sort of offer a longitudinal historical analysis of the other meaning of jihad, the expansion, many times militaristically, of Islam all around the world. So we could start, give us sort of I'll give you the floor, whatever, however long you need, but maybe in 5 minutes, sort of the whole 1400 years of jihad, beginning with Muhammad.
5 minutes. Well, in the first place, we're kidding around here, but in all seriousness, while jihad means struggle in Arabic, and there are just as many struggles in Arabic as there are in English, so that the word can be applied to trivial things and the word can be applied to great things. The jihad can be to lose weight, or the jihad can be a civilizational struggle. And it's the same thing in all kinds of contexts. For example, the Islamic Republic of Iran has a Department of Agricultural Jihad, which doesn't mean blowing things up on the farm. It means trying to increase crop yields and make the farms more efficient. But primarily, in all seriousness, when you look at the meaning of jihad in Islamic theology, its primary meaning is warfare against unbelievers in order to establish the rule of Islamic law over the world and to subjugate those unbelievers as second class under that hegemony of Sharia Islamic law. And so the history of jihad, the actual book, is not actually about Muslims avoiding carbs. It's really about the warfare that Muslims have waged against non-Muslims all around the world in 1400 years in order to impose Sharia upon the non-Muslim world. And this is the first and only book of its kind that covers all of jihad, not just the jihad against Europe, which has been pursued since the 7th century, and has been treated in other books as well, but the jihad against India, the jihad in Africa, Middle East, the various forms of jihad that people don't ordinarily recognize as part of the process, such as the enslavement of non-Muslims. And so the enlightening history is this. The Islamic armies, or the Arab armies at first, they came out of Arabia in the 630s, and they quickly conquered the areas around them, the Middle East and North Africa. The two great powers of the day, the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire, had fought a series of wars against each other in the decades preceding that, and had succeeded only in exhausting each other, so that they were paper tigers. They were empires, but they didn't have any significant military power. The Byzantines controlled, nominally, the Middle East and North Africa, but they didn't even have enough troops to garrison those areas. So, for example, when Muhammad, in his last battle, the Battle of Tabuk, it's not really even a battle. In the summer of 630, he went up to Tabuk in northern Syria, northern Arabia, southern Syria, to fight the Byzantines, and there were no Byzantines there because they were manning the garrisons one by one. Instead of having a permanent presence in all their forts along the border, they had mobile troops who were going from fort to fort and just trying to hold back whatever might come. They weren't ultimately able to hold back the Arabs, and in a very rapid period between the 630s and the 660s, the Arabs conquered all of North Africa and the Middle East and Persia. This is all the beginning of the jihad against the world. It's important to note that none of these places were threatening the Arabs. None of these places were saying we're going to stamp out Islam, which actually was still developing and not really in its final form at all at this time. But in any case, they were not doing anything to the people of Arabia, and the people of Arabia came and conquered them. And then this jihad imperative was formulated that calls for warfare against non-Muslims on an indefinite basis. And on that basis, then, there was the invasion of India and a very bloody jihad there, as I detail in the book, Gad, because the Hindus, of course, are not people of the book. The Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians are people of the book. And that means that they have a legitimate revelation from Allah, although they are supposed to have twisted that revelation and made it mean different things from what it originally meant. So Muslims believe that the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian New Testament are corrupted and changed from their original texts, which has no historical basis, but that's what they believe. In any case, the Hindus have no similar status. The people of the book are allowed to become zimmis, who can live as second-class citizens under the rule of the Islamic empires. But the Hindus did not have this privilege. They were ultimately given it, because they found that there were just too many Hindus to kill. And so they were given honorary dhimmi status. But this did not really result in them being treated any better. And the Hindu temples, especially because they were considered centers of idolatry in ways that churches and synagogues weren't. A lot of churches and synagogues were allowed to continue to exist. A lot of them were destroyed, of course. But the Hindu temples, they were absolutely maniacal in trying to destroy. And the jihad against India was especially bloody. I think one of the main contributions of this book is people don't realize how bloody it was, how brutal it was, and how the government of Pakistan today is still operating according to the same principles. And they don't have the wherewithal to pursue the jihad with that kind of ferocity as it had been by the Mughal emperors and others in the past. But the imperative still remains, and they will pursue it if they get the ability to do so. So the book ultimately, I think, brings the whole thing together. People don't realize also that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is just another front of the jihad. That the Palestinians, there would have been a negotiated peace. There's certainly been many attempts. And there would have been a negotiated peace years ago, were it not for the jihad imperative, which is summed up very simply by Quran chapter 2, verse 191. Drive them out from where they drove you out. And the Palestinians believe, wrongly, but they believe that the Israelis drove them out, and so they have a responsibility before Allah to drive out the Israelis and destroy Israel. This is the first book, or one of the few books, I think, to situate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict within the context of the larger jihad, and to show how it and 9/11 and the Armenian genocide and the Ottoman conquests and the Abbasid conquests, conquest of Spain, the conquest of India, all these things proceed from the same ideological foundation. And 9/11 proceeds from the same ideological foundation. It's still going on. And of course, the end of the book is perhaps the most depressing aspect of it, although I don't mean to depress people by this book. I want to inform them so that we can be resolute and knowledgeable in knowing how we're going to deal with this threat now. But the last chapter, the 10th chapter, Jihad in the 21st Century, is called The West Loses the Will to Live. And I show that the main enemy of the free world today is not so much the jihadis, but the leaders of non-Muslim states who are aiding and abetting their advance in the West and elsewhere.
I've actually made the point that I despise the Westerners who enable the spread of the ideology in the West much more than I do the Islamists, because at least they have a goal, they're motivated, and you could admire them even though you might not agree with their motives. You at least have to admire them for their alacrity. You can't do so when it comes to the Westerners, who are truly exhibiting all of the vices that are most despicable in a human being: cowardice, dishonesty, self-loathing. So I wholeheartedly agree with you. But to go back to the Indian jihad, I've seen figures, and you'll tell me if they have been fully authenticated historically, of something in the order of 80 million victims of that jihad. And I've also seen figures that in the totality, if you were to add up the total number of victims throughout the 1400-year history of jihad, it's in the order of just shy of 300 million. Are these the numbers that seem reasonable to you according to your research?
Yeah, absolutely. It's extraordinary, the just devastation in India. And of course, when we talk about 80 million, people think, well, that's staggering. That's not possible. But you have to remember, this is over a period of over 1,000 years. And it's nonetheless remarkable when you think about that. That means 8 million people per century. It's as if you have a Holocaust every century, and something greater than that, because the jihad in India was just relentless and ongoing. One of the most remarkable things, actually, that I think people will be surprised about in the book, because there's so many. Even just the other day, I was speaking at a marvelous group, and they were very well informed and very committed. But when I started speaking about this, I got people saying, wait a minute, I thought that the history of Islam was full of periods of tolerance and coexistence and multiculturalism and so on. That's one of the historical myths that I shatter in this. And one of the most remarkable things, as I was saying, is that the jihad against India only became a little bit more relaxed. Take, for example, the time of Akbar the Great, who's one of the most intriguing figures in this book. Akbar the Great was a Mughal emperor, the emperor of the Muslim empire in India. And in the 16th century, he became disenchanted with Islam and began to relax a lot of the restrictions on the non-Muslims as a result. So people who think that Islam is a tolerant thing that has been the linchpin of tolerant societies will come up upon Akbar the Great and see he only became tolerant when he became non-Muslim. And his son Jahangir, who he tried very hard to keep from succeeding him, but ultimately was unsuccessful, he had beheaded the fellow who made Akbar the Great disenchanted with Islam, his father, and that is he beheaded the man who got his father disenchanted with Islam, and he reinstituted a lot of these restrictions, although a lot of them were not reinstituted until 2 more generations at the time of Aurangzeb. But he despised his father precisely for not being harsh against the Hindus, and he writes in his own memoirs about a letter that his father actually wrote him saying, how could I be harsh against these people? They're human beings like we are, and we ought to be magnanimous to all human beings. And his son, as a Muslim, thought this was contemptible.
Right. Well, I guess the classic example of the supposed, John Lennon, we all hold hands and love each other under Islam is in Spain. And last year, I had a gentleman, a professor from Northwestern University, who wrote a book. It's somewhere behind me, but I won't turn back to find it. It's sort of the myth about the sort of the golden age of Islam. His name is Dario. I don't know.
Fernandez Moreira.
Exact. Thank you. Lovely guy.
Lucy in Paradise.
Thank
Good
you.
book.
There you go.
Yeah.
And so we had a wonderful chat. And so he, of course, dismantled that whole myth. I think it's because people have an inability to recognize sort of the reality of temporal context. So, for example, I lived in Lebanon as a Jew, and I grew up for 11 years there. And people say, but if Islam is so bad, how come you survived? Well, I survived until I had to leave because I was going to be beheaded, right? So, and the analogy I draw, you're perfectly healthy until you drop dead from a heart attack, right?
Yes.
So people think that because they could point to a very specific temporal window where Islam wasn't beheading everyone, you see, it could be peaceful. But my God, what a standard that is! Because I mean, surely you can understand that every totalitarian ideology at some point took a break to have an espresso before going on and beheading people, right? How do we get people to understand these temporal realities?
Well, I think a key distinction has to be made that people see, oh, there are a lot of Muslims in Lebanon, and Gad lived there for 11 years before he had to flee, so therefore Islam is peaceful. Well, wait a minute. In the first place, Lebanon is not a Sharia state. In other words, it's not implementing Islamic law. And the Christian population there is far more numerous and far more influential than it is in other majority Muslim countries. As a matter of fact, it's still disputed as to whether Lebanon has a Muslim majority or whether it is still a Christian majority state. They haven't held a census there since the 1930s precisely because it's such a political hot button issue, and nobody really wants to see what the demographics exactly are there now. But there's no doubt the Muslim population has increased significantly. Nonetheless, it's still not a Sharia state. And while Muslims there have menaced Christians on many occasions, I have a Lebanese friend, another Lebanese friend, who is a Christian priest, and he was telling me about how he was stopped in traffic just recently by a Muslim mob that was just stopping people in traffic, and he was wearing a pectoral cross, and they surrounded his car, and it was very clear they were going to kill him. But he carries a Quran in his glove compartment for precisely this purpose. He got the Quran out of his glove compartment and held it up, and then the mob dispersed and went off to find somebody else.
Wow.
But this is something that Christians in Lebanon, Christians in Egypt, as you well know, they have to live with this kind of thing every day. And so the question is, the distinction that needs to be made is between Islamic doctrine and the practice in any individual country or the practice of any individual Muslim. And so any individual Muslim may have a number of priorities and principles from Islam, from other things. They may be very devout and knowledgeable. They may not be. They may be very interested in being Muslim. They may think this Islamic thing is a pain in the neck, but I have to go along because there's the death penalty for apostasy. They may think any number of things. So you can't generalize from the behavior of any given Islamic individual or even a majority Muslim country. You have to look at Islamic doctrine. So what I do in this book is I look at Islamic doctrine, which of course I've done before, and then what's new in this book is that I show how, for 14 centuries, this is how Muslims understood Islamic doctrine. Obviously not all Muslims, but some of them were off going to the gym because that was their jihad. But the others, they were waging war against unbelievers. And this warfare, there were enough Muslims throughout history who believed that it was warfare against unbelievers, that this warfare is essentially constant throughout Islamic history with no breaks, no respite, no reformation, no reconsideration.
But just one quick point. So I'm not sure when the last official census was conducted in Lebanon, but sort of from the sources that I hear, and I'm assuming they're reasonably veridical, it's now roughly 2/3 Muslim, whereas until about maybe 30, 40 years ago, it was Christian majority. But now there's still a sizable Christian population in Lebanon, but it's clear that it is now a Muslim majority country. So that
Yes.
for
Yeah,
whatever.
well, Iran has been bringing Shiites in large numbers to join Hezbollah and to try to turn Lebanon into a Shiite satellite. And they've actually done very well with that. Hezbollah has a significant presence in the Lebanese government, and it's because of this rapid population growth. But there's still been no official census. The Christians are still powerful enough there that they've been able to stave that off. Once there is a new official census, then their political power will be substantially diminished.
So so now across universities in North America, some administrator will stand up when there's, for example, the awarding of the diplomas, and will self-flagellate that they are sitting on conquered land. This is Iroquois land. This is Algonquin land. We apologize for even existing here, and so on. So there is definitely an ethos of self-loathing in the West, whereby somehow Western powers are the ones who are responsible for imperialism, for colonialism. Whereas the reality, and hence the whole point, the whole gist of your book, is that there is this ideology that when it comes to the Olympics of imperialism and colonialism, stands alone on the gold medal podium. Yet, of course, most Westerners will never admit to that, right? So, Christopher Columbus is a pig who came and spread genocide to the noble folks here. How do we get people to understand? I mean, I guess that's the point of your book, but how do you explain this inability to just navigate through historical realities in an honest manner? What's stopping? What's the obstacle?
Well, I don't think that people do look at historical realities. And there's also a concerted effort to whitewash these historical realities. The Islamic advocacy groups have been extraordinarily clever. And I don't know whether these professors are bought and paid for by Saudi interests or other moneyed Islamic interests, or whether they really believe what they're saying. But, we mentioned Dario Fernandez Moreira in The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise. And his book is one of the sources I used. It's even worse than he says, actually, because I have other material from other sources to speak about Muslim Spain in my book. And why do books like that have to be written? Why does a book like mine have to be written? Because there's so many academics today who are saying that there was no jihad imperialism and there was no subjugation of the non-Muslims. And they actively lie to people and mislead people. And so books like Fernandez Moreira's and mine, they set the record straight. Also with the jihad in India, there's a professor at Rutgers, Audrey Trushki, and I found an article by her saying that the reign of Aurangzeb in India was a notable period of tolerance in which Muslims and Hindus lived together in harmony and peace. Now, this is not just inaccurate, it's an outrage to history. Aurangzeb was, as I show in the book, an incredibly brutal tyrant who was absolutely bloodthirsty and energetic in his pursuit of the death and destruction of the Hindu population. And so you got to wonder, what is a woman like that thinking? And how is it that she got to be a professor at Rutgers? And I think when we ponder that, my only explanation for it is you look at Al-Walid bin Talal, the Saudi billionaire who owns a piece of Fox News, he owns a piece of Twitter, and he gave $10 million to Harvard, he gave $10 million to Georgetown, he's given millions of dollars to other American universities as well. And I don't think he's the only one. And I don't know if there is a direct monetary connection between these professors and Al-Walid, but certainly they're very useful to him and to others like him who are trying to pursue an agenda of keeping Americans ignorant and complacent about the nature and magnitude of the jihad threat.
I think, certainly there's a financial angle, sort of a very pragmatic explanation as the one that you just offered. But I actually think it's a lot more insidious than this. And that's really the point of my next book, where I formally go into my diagnosis of the collective malady, which I refer to as ostrich parasitic syndrome. Ostrich parasitic syndrome is the metaphor of the ostrich that buries its head to deny reality. And parasitic because in the same way that biological pathogens can enter an organism's brain and rewire it in a way that it engages in maladaptive behaviors, I argue that there are idea pathogens that are maladaptive. So postmodernism, there is no absolute truth. My truth is just as good as your truth. That's what allows the Rutgers professor to espouse her views. Cultural relativism, well, who are you to say that cutting off the clitoris is a bad thing if that's there, right? Radical feminism, there is no such thing as biological sex. Biological sex is on a continuum. So there's a bunch of strains of idea pathogens, none of which alone would be enough to eradicate the edifice of reason. But when put together in this fatal melange of bullshit, you end up with the inability to fight against realities that are as clear as the existence of gravity. I think that's really ultimately what's causing the professor at Rutgers and all of the rest of the folks. Because I think more than the money, I genuinely believe that they believe their bullshit, right?
Yes.
So what do you think of this additional explanation to what you said?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's terrific. And also, there's peer pressure. Once you get that kind of thing going and these parasitical ideas becoming mainstream, they roll along and they replicate themselves by means of simple peer pressure that those who are outside, those people like me, who I'm saying these things and it's terrible. If I say Aurangzeb was a bloodthirsty tyrant who oppressed the Hindus to a remarkable degree, people will say, oh, you're a racist Islamophobe. And nobody wants to be a racist Islamophobe. And so these professors are kept in line, and the enlightened thinkers, so-called, are kept in line by means of ridicule. That they know that if they step off the reservation, the intellectual reservation, they'll be called names, they will be ridiculed, they will be called stupid and agenda-driven and worse. And so they stay in line because they want to be invited to the good parties. They want to be in the in-group.
I mean, there's no way, had you been an academic, that you would have been able to write all your books and espouse all your open positions. Would it be accurate to say this?
Oh, yeah, there's no chance whatsoever. I saw that in the 80s when I was getting my master's. And I wanted to continue and to get a doctorate, but I thought if I do this, I'm going to be constantly coming against these people who state dogmatically things that I believe are false and assume that they're true and make you assume that they're true. And so I thought I'm just going to go out and go out on my own and try to do this in the court of public opinion rather than in the academic world.
Now, what do you think explains the fact that you draw such ire from people? Is it because so I was trying to think about this prior to us getting on the show, because many people criticize Islam. And personally, I've challenged people. When I first had a chat with you, I challenged people to identify exact places where you were clearly bigoted against Muslim. And of course, nobody's ever written back and shown anything. But yet, you are sort of on the mantle of, the hateful Islamophobic bigots. Do you think it's because people associate the fact that all that you do, it's not as though you write about biology and about Islam. You're just a guy who focuses all of your time and efforts to criticize Islam, and therefore you can't sort of dilute that among a broader range of efforts. Could that be the reason? Because I find it perplexing, because there's a lot of people out there who criticize Islam in all sorts of different ways, none of whom are hateful, none of whom are bigoted, but yet somehow you stand amongst sort of the chosen ones as the epitome of the hateful guy. Why is that, according to you?
My best guess to this, and it is just a guess, is that it's because I was the first, or among the first. And the Council on American Islamic Relations and other groups like it made a decision in the 90s, when I was just getting started doing this publicly, to stigmatize and demonize and ultimately destroy anybody who spoke about how there are elements of Islam that actually incite violence among Muslims. And so, when I started doing this, when I published my first book, it was just Daniel Pipes, Steve Emerson, and me who were talking about these issues at all. That was it.
Right.
And Pipes said, moderate Islam is the solution. And I actually argued with him and said, well, that would be great, but where's the moderate Islam?
Right.
There are lots of moderate Muslims, but there is no mainstream sect of Islam that teaches peaceful coexistence with unbelievers as equals on an indefinite basis. Even the Ahmadiyya, who reject violent jihad, ultimately want to see Sharia ruling the world, which would mean the second-class status for non-Muslims. So that, and Emerson doesn't talk about Islam at all. He knows where all the bodies are buried in terms of what Hamas is doing and what Hezbollah is doing and what all the rest of them are doing in the United States. So I was the only one really with any kind of prominence in the early part of the 21st century, right after 9/11, who was saying anything about how this had to do with Islam and that there was a problem within Islam itself. And so I think I became the test case and the first victim of the character assassination effort that CARE and others carried out in order to stigmatize and destroy anybody who speaks about how this has to do with Islam. And I do see it now happening. Of course, now there are plenty of people who do this, and they all really, anybody who says anything, they round upon and try to destroy. Just recently, I had at Jihad Watch a story of a woman in a suburb of Chicago who is a board member for the town board in her town. I don't even remember the name of the town that she's in, but she wrote about how there were Muslim immigrant children in the schools in that area, and they had not been vetted, and wrote about the perils of unrestricted and unvetted immigration. And for that now, whenever there's a town board meeting in this town, there are all these people who show up with signs saying that she has to resign. Now, what she said was absolutely true and relatively innocuous. She didn't say Islam teaches warfare against unbelievers. She didn't say make any large sweeping statements. She made some perfectly demonstrable, readily substantiatable observations, but they're trying to destroy her nonetheless. There was a fellow in Texas, same thing. He's in Plano, I think, and he's got some position or other. And very recently he said that Islam should not be taught in the public schools. And all these people are calling for his resignation. I think actually he did ultimately resign or was forced to resign. I'm not entirely sure of that. But in any case, there was a lot of pressure on him to resign. And he apologized abjectly. But the fact is, I have documented evidence. I just wrote a pamphlet on this for the David Horowitz Freedom Center. There are plenty of examples, abundant examples, of Islam being taught as fact in American public schools. Now, whether that is the result of some concerted effort or whether it's the result of the multiculturalist, the spread of these parasitical ideas, as you heard about, or some combination of both, I don't know. But nonetheless, it is happening. There are instances all over. And so is it so terrible to say that this should not be going on? Apparently it is. And he was rounded upon and demonized. It's a very concerted effort that anybody who notes anything remotely negative or critical about Islam becomes targeted in this manner. And you have to wonder, when there are Islamic jihadis carrying out 30,000 plus jihad attacks around the world since 9/11, what is going on that it has become ingrained in the consciousness of the West that it's somehow wrong to talk about this and wrong to analyze the root causes of it?
You know, in your book, you talk about history of jihad, and I'm assuming much of it relates to military jihad. Yet, of course, we both know that the spread of Islam can happen using a broad range of strategies. As we both know, and I'll repeat it here for our viewers who may not know this, several Islamic politicians and thinkers have said, look, we will conquer the West through the womb of our women, through hijrah, immigration, and by using your miserable freedoms against you. And in a sense, to me, that is the much more dangerous form of jihad. It is non-military jihad. It is boiling the frog bit by bit jihad while everybody goes about their business. Because when you look in the West, you're not going to conquer the West by militarily ruling. But what you can do is you can have the following reality. 15 years ago, from 1975 to 2003, when we returned from Southern California, I had seen a single woman who had wearing a veil in Montreal. One time I had seen a woman next to campus wearing a veil. One time in close to 30 years. From 2003 till now, I can walk downtown as I did last weekend, and if you threw me in that spot and didn't tell me where I was, it would be impossible for me to tell you whether I was in Yemen, in Raqqa, in Saudi Arabia. That's the extent to which there were veiled women everywhere. Now, does this imply that these women are not lovely and sweet and kind? Of course not. But does it imply that there is something to be said about the incursion of the demography of Islam into the West? Yes. How do we get people to understand that threat without them thinking that one is being bigoted in making that point?
Well, they're going to say that you're bigoted if you make any point about how the Islamization of the West is maybe not a good idea and how it would infringe upon the freedom of speech, the freedom of conscience, the equality of rights of women, and much more. But the fact is that it's all the same jihad. This is a key point of the book, actually, that the demographic trends that you're talking about, the mass Muslim migration into Europe and into North America in the 21st century is ultimately motivated, as many of the people who've come have said freely, by the same principles that animated the military jihads of the past and of the present. That ultimately the goal is the Islamization of the lands to which they are coming. Now, this is not really, it shouldn't really be a controversial point. The Quran promises blessings to those who emigrate in the cause of Allah, which is the hijrah, to move from one place to another, not to get a good job, not to get out of a war zone, but to bring Islam to the new area. And when we look at Europe and we see the rise of these no-go zones, these enclaves where Islamic law is de facto enforced, and people say, oh, no, that's not really happening. Well, in the first place, it depends on what you mean by a no-go zone. It's not that non-Muslims can't go in. It's that Islamic law is essentially the law of the area. I was in one. I was in Molenbeek in Antwerp a few years back, the notorious area where many jihadis, the jihadis who killed 130 people in Paris in November 2015, who incidentally, all of them had just come into Europe as refugees the month before. And they went and hid in Molenbeek for months before they were discovered. I was walking through there a few years back. I was pretending to be an ordinary American tourist. I went into a halal butcher shop. I was going to take a tourist picture, and the halal butcher got very angry. And he said, pictures are not allowed here. Now, pictures are perfectly legal to take anywhere in Belgium, but not in a Sharia area.
Right.
And a Muslim is talking to a non-Muslim and telling him how he has to behave.
Well, and the audacity with which you make those demands rises as a function of the number of folks who share your faith, right? So when there's only two of us, I can't come up to you and tell you your dog offends me. When there are 2,000 of us, I tell you no dogs here. When there's only two of us, I can't tell your woman cover up. You're in a Muslim area. When there's 2,000 of us, I can't tell you that. So again, people simply don't understand the mechanism by which these realities unfold. And they think that, all we need to do is vet those noble Syrian refugees to make sure they're not ISIS members. And as long as we do that, then we've done a good job. And as I explained to Sam Harris on his podcast, the greatest danger is not the singular ISIS guy who comes in. He's a bad guy, but he's a small drop in the bigger bucket. The bigger issue is if you let in 100,000 people, of which 95% of them have genocidal Jew hatred in their hearts, have hatred towards gays, have hatred towards women's clitorises, then that's the bigger issue that you have to worry about. And yet somehow I say this to people and they look at me as if I'm speaking in a foreign language. How do we get them to understand these incredibly simple ideas?
I think the force of reality is always breaking through, that propaganda is constantly being repeated because it is propaganda. It can only be successful by dint of constant repetition. And all we have to do is continue to state reality, and I think reality does dawn on people. And I've had many people tell me that when they first heard about me, they thought that I was a terrible racist Islamophobe, but then something happened. The London attack happened, the Madrid attack happened, Nice, Berlin, any number of them now.
The 31,000 plus attacks since 9/11 alone in almost 70 countries.
And so reality started to dawn, or when they happened upon some jihadi explaining that he did this according to the teachings of the Quran and in imitation of Muhammad. And so they realized that what I was saying was true. And it's very easy, really, to stand in terms of to stand on the reality in this case. What is difficult is to break through that propaganda, but I think we have reality on our side, the day's headlines on our side, the simple fact of the constant advance of the jihad on our side. The more they win, the more they lose. The more they advance, the more people wake up.
But let me ask you this, though. How is it that if you now no longer have a clear physical line, the Camp A is on the right-hand side, Camp B is on the left-hand side. Now everybody is enmeshed with one another, right? So I've predicted that you're going to have in 50, 60, 100 years the repeat of Lebanon civil war all over the world. How could you actually end up winning this war, which is ultimately a battle of ideas, when the quote enemy, and again, let me preface this, and I hate to say this, the enemy are not individual Muslims. I have more Muslim friends than most people will ever meet in their lives. 99% of Muslims that I've met are lovely. I've had Muslim students, Muslim colleagues who are nothing but lovely. We're talking about the incursion of an ideology which people can either take seriously or not. How could we win the battle when they are now behind the gates in the hundreds of millions all over the West?
Yeah, it is astonishing. I have of course, the Siege of Vienna in the book, September 11th, 1683, and how it was broken. And now they're just inviting them back. At the Battle of Tours, 732, when the Muslim advance into France was stopped. And Edward Gibbon, the great English historian, says, if the battle had gone the other way, then the Quran would be taught today in Oxford. Well, it is.
Yeah,
now it's all happened, and they've invited them in. And it is, I think, I agree with you that I don't see any good outcome to this unless there is a massive change in our political and media elites, and I don't see that coming. And unless there is a wholesale reevaluation of our stance toward immigration, toward foreign policy in numerous ways, then we're asking for civil war in the future. And it is going to be Lebanon here. There's no way to avoid that, because Islam isn't different here. It's not that, as you say, any individual Muslim might be a wonderful person, but there are always going to be Muslims who take up the Islamic doctrines of jihad. Now, we are not calling upon Islamic groups in the United States to renounce those aspects of Islam and to teach against those aspects of Islam in American mosques. If we were, things might be different. But since we're not, we're just asking for trouble, and the trouble is certain to come, as history's record is clear, and there's no reason why it's going to be any different here at all.
Well, to alter the immigration policies moving forward stops the problem from getting exacerbated, right? It stops the worsening of the problem, but they're already here in a sufficient number, right? So that even though most folks are going to live here peacefully, once you have, a critical mass of Islam in a society, the patterns are very clear based on 1400 years of history in every place where Islam has become dominant. And so I see really three possibilities, and then maybe you can weigh in on each. Possibility one is the reform possibility. And so I won't mention all three. I'll ask you to comment on each. So the reform one, which I gather is one that you don't agree with and find it impossible, and I tend to agree with that, would be, for example, the guy who's come in recently on the scene, who's become a good friend, who's been on my show a few times, Imam Tawhidi out of Australia, is someone who is saying, hey, look, there is a doctrinal path to reform Islam in ways that it becomes palatable with Western civilization. Majid Nawaz, who I'm not a huge fan of, also has argued similar things. But of course, the reality is they're hardly the first ones to come up with let's do reform. It's never worked. So do you think that there is a doctrinal path to reforming Islam, or is this a complete unicorn dream?
I tend to think it's a unicorn dream. I have to say, though, I have to add a caveat, and that is history is full of strange surprises that nobody could have foreseen. And so I can't say that Islamic reform is impossible or could never happen, but I don't see how it could happen. Because Islam, in the first place, chapter 5, verse 3 of the Quran, Allah tells Muhammad, "This day I have perfected your religion for you." How can you reform what's perfect? And Muslims believe that Islam is the perfect religion that Allah gave to the world. How can you reform the perfect religion? And there's never been, as you say, it's never happened. There are, in the book, The History of Jihad, I have lots of Islamic reformers, not only the Wahhabis, but also the Almoravids, the Almohads, the Mahdi in Sudan. All these people came up saying, the individuals who founded these movements, they came in around saying that Islam had strayed from its original teachings and they were going to restore it to its purity, and they made it more violent than it was, not less. Right. Also, you have Mahmud Muhammad Taha in Sudan, who taught that the Meccan peaceful verses should supersede the Medinan violent verses, which is backwards from how most
which means the opposite of the abrogation mechanism.
Exactly. And he was executed as a heretic by the Sudanese government. You have Ahmed Assid in Morocco, who I have immense respect for, who is a human rights activist who taught the same thing quite recently. And a fatwa was put out on his head, a death fatwa, and he has to live in hiding. So Islamic reform is very difficult when heresy and apostasy have a death penalty, and reform is considered to be heresy and apostasy. So I would say, a Tawhidi is a good guy who says a lot of good things. Majid Nawaz is another thing. We could have another show about him. But as far as these individuals go, I'm sure that Tawhidi has good intentions, but I don't see these people having large movements among Muslims. And this is because most Muslims know that what they're saying is not traditional Islam, and it's not really what's in the Quran, and so they can't go along with it.
Okay, so if we put so that was option one. Option two, say Hamid Abdel Samad. Do you know who that is?
Yes.
Yeah, so he's been on my show a few times. He was in Montreal now for a stay. I actually appeared on his show, Sandu al-Islam, which means the box of Islam. It'll be out soon in Arabic. He actually argues, he's also in line with us. And by the way, of course, he speaks fluent Arabic. He knows the Quran and the Hadith inside out. His dad was an imam. So you can't argue, but he doesn't know. He's Robert Spencer who lives somewhere in the U.S. He doesn't speak Arabic, right? So he ticks all the boxes. And he says the reform thing is a bunch of BS. He says you actually have to get people to engage their critical thinking. In other words, basically he's saying in a polite way, leave Islam. Or practice it in some cultural way, in the same way that I'm Jewish, although I don't sit there and put on my tefillin every day, and yet I still identify as someone who comes from a Jewish heritage. Do you see that as a possibility? Could you have a sufficiently compelling ideological warfare so that in droves, hundreds of millions of Muslims might say, you know what, we live in a new world, 21st century, it's science, we're done with Islam? Could that happen?
I don't think it could happen on a large scale, but I'm all for attempting it. I've been calling for years. I've said for years that the only real possibility of reform would have to be a rejection of Quranic literalism, and the idea that maybe these are stories that had to do with the past. Of course, Islam. A lot of deceptive Islamic apologists say that
it's contextual. It's contextual.
Yeah, they only have to do with the 7th century. Yeah. So this perfect book that's valid for all time, most of it doesn't apply to us. But anyway, aside from that, the idea that you could reject Quranic literalism is hampered by the mainstreaming of literalism in Islamic theology. All the schools of jurisprudence, all the mainstream tafsir, the commentaries on the Quran, they all approach it quite literally and approach the violent passages as being marching orders for all Muslims for all time. So I'm sympathetic to the idea. I wish it all success. But also you have to come up against the fact that Islam has a tremendous hold upon most adherents. It's very hard to break through. I remember once when I was in college, way back in the early 80s, and I used to have lunch with my friend Mahmoud, who was Palestinian, and he was trying to convert me to Islam. And I was willing to discuss it with him and talk about Quran and such, which I was reading for the first time at the time. And I remember coming upon the passage where Allah says, we could have guided all men to the truth, but instead we will fill hell with jinns and men. And so Allah is saying, I could have saved everybody, but I decided not to. I decided to torture these people instead. And I read this passage to him and asked him, Mahmoud, how is that just? You say Allah is just. And I could see, he had an idea. And it was very troubling. And he said he had to go. And he didn't meet with me for like 3 months after that. And then he did meet once, and I brought up the same question. And he just shut it down entirely. Said, he is just. That's it. Well, then how do you explain? No explanation. He is just. Right. And I think this was an illustrative example of how this, the idea of leaving Islam, the idea that Islam might not be true, it's really actively frightening for a lot of Muslims. And they don't dare go there. Also because of the tremendous social control, the tremendous conformism that's in Islamic communities, such that you can be ostracized, you can even be physically attacked. You know, are you familiar with Majid Rafizadeh?
I don't think so, no.
He's wonderful. He writes these very harrowing books, very harrowing. And I read one of his books recently that was essentially a memoir about how he was growing up in Iran and Syria. His father was Iranian and his mother was Syrian, and he spent many years in both. And in the Islamic Republic, he had this, he grew more skeptical and ultimately left Islam, and he started talking to his friends, quite incautiously, I must say, about how he was no longer a Muslim. And one of them said one day, I'm very interested in talking to you about this. Will you meet me at such and such a time and place? So he naively is waiting for his friend there. He's trundled off into a car. He's taken to a place and tortured for days, and they're going to kill him until they find out that his sister is a famous reciter of the Quran who does it very beautifully. And they get scared that he might have powerful friends, and they let him go. Wow. It's a remarkable story. I highly recommend it. I wish I could remember the name of the book. It's a very long title, though, and I'm sorry. But his name is Majid Rafizadeh, and tremendous writer. And the point that I'm making in bringing him up is that this is what people who start to question Islam face if they're in Muslim countries, especially in a place like the Islamic Republic, that he was likely to have been killed. It just happened by chance that he was not. And many, many others, of course, have been.
Well, and I think that to the extent that this is a battle of ideas, this is precisely why someone like you has to be run out of town, has to be attacked, has to be demonized, because they know that ultimately, if you're going to have a defeat of Islam in the arena of ideas, then you can't have a fair debate. Because if you were to truly allow people to step into the metaphorical boxing ring and each to present his or her side, then probably Islam, look, if Islam is the way, then you should feel sufficiently confident about it that you shouldn't never have to put people under death threats and so on, right? Hamid Abdel Samad shouldn't have to walk around with 75 German police, right? But it's precisely because that's how you would end up losing the battle. I mean, what more evidence do you need than that?
I have debated a lot of imams and Muslim spokesmen. You can find the debates on YouTube. But at the same time, the list of those who have contemptuously refused to debate or accepted and then backed out is very long. Right. And this is because I think ultimately they know what I'm saying is true. And their claims about Islam being peaceful and so on, they can't stand up to scrutiny. And so they ultimately decide they're not going to subject themselves to that scrutiny.
Well, I've appeared on Joe Rogan's show many times, and he's got a bigger platform than I think CNN, CBS, and CBC, and all the rest of them combined. And whenever we discuss Islam, there'll be a bunch of Muslims who come there and say, this Jew, this pig, is spreading falsehoods. It's not true that Islam hates the Jews. It's only because he's a disgusting Jewish filthy pig, right? so the irony is missed on them, right? They don't put that together. And then of course there's a whole bunch of other Muslims who come in and say, well, I'm a Muslim, and there is not a single syllable that he said that wasn't perfectly accurate. So in a sense, we need to find those honest ones, the ones who, look, I think that you could be proud of many, many things that came out of Islamic societies. There's Islamic architecture, there's Islamic music. I mean, and what I mean by Islamic, I mean that it has flourished within those societies, right? I mean, there is such a thing as Danish folkloric dance, right? There is such a thing as Armenian cuisine. So there is endless ways by which I can be proud of my Islamic heritage without, while completely rejecting all of the booga booga hateful stuff, right? In the exact same way that I could be very Jewish and that I belong to a lineage of people that have a shared history, but yet I reject all the religious BS. By the way, I should mention, when I say that, when I see, tons of women who are veiled, and I find it, and by the way, many Canadians find it extraordinarily jarring. If we were to substitute that by having now 400,000 Orthodox Jews coming in magically to downtown Montreal, so that when I walked around, I felt I was in an ultra-Orthodox Jerusalem neighborhood, I would find that too jarring. Now, I wouldn't find it as jarring because Orthodox Jews are not trying to kill me as a Jew, whereas the other ones are, but I would still find that contemptible because I don't want to live in a society where demographically hardcore Orthodox Jews are the dominant group, because I don't share their worldview. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't lovely Orthodox Jews. I've known many. I've been invited to many Shabbat dinners. A rabbi at Cornell was a very good friend of mine, and he's lovely. But I wouldn't want to have an infusion of 400,000 Orthodox Jews walking around in Montreal magically from one day to the next. That certainly doesn't make me a Jewish anti-Semite. Right? It basically says that I want to live in a society where secularism, where a commitment to science, where a commitment to free thinking is what is driving that society. To the extent that Islam is incompatible with those views, then I have every perfectly reasonable right to say, you know what, having 200,000 new Muslims in Montreal might not be good for my children moving forward, for them to wear a Star of David. What do you think of that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I believe very strongly that the best society is a pluralistic secular society in which we all essentially leave each other alone. We don't try to impose our own views on others who don't hold them. We respect one another, and we live together without one group trying to gain hegemony over the others. I'm all for everything that I do is dedicated toward preserving a society of that kind against groups that are essentially and inherently hegemonic. And this is, of course, Sharia personified. Sharia is the only religious law that has a political extension and tries to impose itself on non-believers. And so, therefore, anybody really who believes in a free society and a pluralistic society should oppose its spread in the West.
Well, and again, just while of course we're talking here about Islamic hegemony, but just to sort of to demonstrate to people that there's a greater principle here that is driving me. Let's go back to the Orthodox Jews. When I drive through a neighborhood in Montreal called Outremont, where there's a preponderance of Orthodox Jews, and I look at the little children, it annoys me. Why? Because I know that every single minutia of their future trajectory has been decided for them, right? They will believe this, they will dress this way, they will get up this way. So there is absolutely almost zero free agency in those children. And as I see them scurrying along, all dressed in exactly the same way, because totalitarianism could only work through conformity. It can't work through the elevation of individual dignity. As I see them, it pisses me off. Nobody's going to accuse me of being an anti-Semite, right? But the added problem with Islam is that, unlike the Orthodox Jews, who are the most meek that you could imagine, right? I mean, they're not trying. As a matter of fact, in Judaism, you're not allowed to proselytize, right? So in a sense, it is the worst marketing religion of all time, right? It doesn't try to get new customers and new adherents. And if you want to join the group, then we'll put you through years of testing. Whereas in other religions, you just have to say one sentence and boom, you're in, and you could never leave. Now that's marketing genius. So the idea is that there is a broader principle, which is elevate human dignity, elevate individual liberty. And to the extent that Islam, not individual Muslims, are an obstacle to this, we have every right to question it and be concerned about it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. individual liberty, indeed. I mean, the only thing I would say about the Orthodox Jews is that I would oppose, and I'm sure you would also oppose, any attempt to compel them or anyone else to change their culture, change their practice. If they're in that system, they're in that system. I know people who have left it, and so it's not the kind of thing like Islam where it's a closed system and there's a death penalty for apostasy and so on. The big problem with the real problem with Islam is not within Islam itself, although I do feel for Muslim women, and I understand that it's very difficult, if not impossible, for Muslim women to leave that system should they so choose, because the social web is so strong and the threats are so present. But at the same time, the big problem is that Islam impinges upon non-Muslims and makes demands upon them. They don't want to just believe as Muslims and leave us alone. And this is why this book had to be written, that there's 1,400 years of Muslims impinging upon non-Muslims, and it's going to continue. And meanwhile, we have the non-Muslim authorities today saying, oh, no, there isn't any such imperative within Islam, and anybody who thinks so is a terrible person, and that just makes it even worse.
Wow. So the third, just to kind of close, remember I said there were three possible options. Option one is reform. Option two, get people to leave through sort of critical thinking and a commitment to reason. Option three, which I suggested to Andrew McCarthy, who I think you know very well, who was a former federal prosecutor who came on the show, I think a couple of years ago, who is a lawyer, and therefore this question was relevant to ask him. Do you ever foresee that to the extent that so much of the Islamic doctrines are antithetical with our liberties, that the ideology can be declared seditious, so that there would be a legal framework by which you can say, look, if you want to believe in giving zakat, alms, if you want to believe about, the small spiritual part, go for it. But all that other stuff, I'm not going to wait for Reformation to come or not come. I'm going to legally mandate that that's off the books. And if you don't want that, then you're not welcome here. Do you ever foresee that that might be the solution?
Well, I don't know that that's possible. Andy, of course, is a lawyer, and I'm not. I don't see how you could take a whole ideology and say it's seditious as such. Maybe there is a way, but I do think that a way forward is to emphasize that aspects of it are criminal, indeed, already under American law. I mean, you take, for example, polygamy. Polygamy is illegal in the United States. Now, there are plenty of Muslims who are in polygamous marriages in the United States, and there's no prosecutions, no investigations, nobody cares. And that, if we were to start to enforce as a matter of saying that we want to have one law for all people, and we understand that polygamy is infringing upon the rights of women and treating them as commodities instead of as equal human beings of equal dignity, then that would go a long way toward doing what you're saying. And if we take other aspects of Islam and Sharia in the same way, they're already illegal. We just have to enforce it.
So that is, I think, the approach of David Yerushalmi, who was also on my show, who does happen to be an Orthodox Jew. So I think you are championing his approach. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think so. David has done a lot of legal cases for us with Pamela Geller and I in the American Freedom Defense Initiative in fighting for the freedom of speech against restrictions on our advertising and other things. And so I think that it's very likely that David and I see eye to eye on this. Right. And Andy also as well. It might be a difference in strategy, but not in the ultimate goal of protecting a free society. Andy actually, if you'll permit me, I think that he said about this book that from its inception, as Robert Spencer incontestably illustrates, jihad has been the outward aggressive expression of a conquest ideology. The history of jihad from Muhammad to ISIS is as relentless in relating unvarnished truth as is the phenomenon it tracks in seeking domination and never being satisfied with less, however long it takes. Those who care to preserve Western rationalism, civil liberties, and free societies must confront this history and its implications with eyes opened. Andrew McCarthy.
Nice. All right. As we approach the end of our chat, as I always tell my guests, all of whom are incredibly fascinating. I could keep you here for another 4 hours, but I'm sure we'll have another chance to chat. Are there any projects that you'd like to use this opportunity to promote that people might not be aware of that you'd like to share here?
Well, I suppose really the main thing, Gad, is the book. The
Right.
book is, as I say, this is the most important book I've ever written. This is the crown and culmination of all my work for well over 2 decades now. It completes the case that I've been making that there is a very problematic aspect to Islamic theology. This shows how it plays out in history. It's not just something that we found in dusty old books that nobody pays attention to. And this is the history of jihad from Muhammad to ISIS. It's going to be available August 7th in any self-respecting bookstore, and it's available for pre-order now in Amazon and Barnes & Noble online.
I must say that it is incontestable that you've been the greatest marketer of your book to ever appear on the show. So as a professor of marketing and as an evolutionary behavioral scientist, I tip my hat to your alacrity in promoting your work. Well done. People who, by the way, say that self-promotion is whatever, is gauche and so on, I say no, it's called marketing. So hats
Yes.
off, hat tip to you. Thanks so much, Robert. Stay on the line for a second to chat for a second or two offline. Great having you on the show. Look forward to our next chat.
Thank you. I do as well.
Cheers, buddy.